All right, I'm really excited about today's episode, Craig, because A. Philip Randolph is a figure for myself who lives in Northeast Florida. I worked in Jacksonville 9 years, saw the name. A. Philip Randolph High School, A. Philip Randolph Boulevard. You'd see the name, but it's like, who's this guy? When did he live? I don't know. I've seen him come up more and more as I research Black history and civil rights and different things that I write about. But A. Philip Randolph, and we'll get into this with today's guest, Alan Bliss, who's the CEO of the Jacksonville Historical Society. This is a titan who
Yeah,
was a Florida man.
yeah, he's a huge towering figure in the history of civil rights. And definitely they don't know that he grew up in Florida, and what he learned and saw here as a child is what shaped his views and ultimately led to some tremendous civil rights advances.
Previous episodes, you'd be interested if this one sparks your curiosity. We've done an episode on Jacksonville, American Beach, Abraham Lincoln Lewis, who would have been a peer to A. Philip Randolph, Zora Neale Hurston, Mary McLeod Bethune, the Beatles in Florida, our episode on Martin Luther King in St. Augustine. That all, sort of is tangential to today's episode about A. Philip Randolph with our guest, Alan Bliss, CEO of the Jacksonville Historical Society.
Dr. Bliss, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Do people even are people even aware of A. Philip Randolph's tremendous contributions these days, or has he sort of slipped into obscurity, do you think?
Well, thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss a man who has fascinated me for decades. And the answer to your question is, I think even here in Jacksonville, the place where he grew up, he's under-recognized. We don't do enough to acknowledge the legacy of this man, who, in my judgment, was the greatest civil rights leader of the United States of the 20th century. And that's comparing him to some pretty imposing figures. You probably don't need me to say that, we would count W.E.B. Du Bois in that pantheon, and also Martin Luther King. With all due respect to those guys and all due respect to the work that they did, Mr. Randolph was the giant, I think. And he connected so many of the different links in the way that Black Americans sought to find their way to greater justice and greater equality in this society. He was quiet and relatively, even though he had a distinctive and deep, mellifluous voice, but he didn't achieve the notoriety from his dynamic speaking that Martin Luther King did. He wasn't the polemicist. He wasn't provocative the way people like Du Bois was. Certainly not like Marcus Garvey. Certainly not along the lines of any of the more militant advocates for Black justice. But man, oh man, without Mr. Randolph, it would be unlikely that there would have been any of the federal legislation that moved toward equal rights in federal employment in the 1940s and in the 1950s. Would have been less likely that the U.S. Armed Forces would have been integrated when they were in 1948 by executive order by President Truman. And it would have been very unlikely, I think, really impossible that there would have been such a thing as the March on Washington in August of 1963 that put Dr. Martin Luther King on the map.
Tell me about his childhood. He grew up there in Jacksonville. What were his parents like? What was the city like?
Mr. Randolph was born in Crescent City, Florida, which is about 45 minutes south of here. He was born on April 15th, 1889. So this month would be his 135th birthday if he were living. And he and his parents moved to Jacksonville when he was about 2 years old. His father was a minister in the AME church, and he moved to Jacksonville to take over this church. His mother raised Mr. Randolph and his brother at home, and their home was on Jesse Street, which is just about 10 blocks from the office that I'm sitting in right now as I'm speaking to you on the east side of Jacksonville. The house itself no longer stands. We've identified the lot, and we're at work on trying to get a historic site marker approved to place on the public right of way. The property, it's in private property ownership, and the current property owner seems to have no particular interest in memorializing the history of that site. But nevertheless, the people in the neighborhood who are advocates for sort of uplifting that history in the historic East Side area, they're aware of the importance of that history, and we're trying to be supportive of them. So you asked about his childhood. He grew up in a literate household, and he grew up, as I mentioned, the son of a minister. And it's one of the things that has kind of had me scratching my head for some time about Mr. Randolph and his upbringing. He never, in his adult life, he never really gave a lot of voice. We don't have him speaking about matters of the spirit. We don't have him in any way using the principles of Christianity or any of the other religions that were sometimes called into play by advocates for social justice. Certainly, Dr. King, cloaked himself in advocacy for social justice on the basis of the principles of Christianity, right? You don't hear that from Mr. Randolph. And it's interesting, isn't it, when you consider that he was raised by a minister. His father taught him and his brother that they were as good as anyone, but he also taught them that they had to understand that they were starting from a place of disadvantage owing to prejudice on the part of white Americans. He identified and called out the existence of the concept of white racial supremacy and racism on the part of white Americans. But he also, and this is in Mr. Randolph's own recollection, he also told Mr. Randolph as a child, and told his brother, that they shouldn't view whites as necessarily racist by nature or by their identity. He said, you will find that there are whites who see you as an equal and who treat you as an equal. And he said, you need to be prepared to recognize that. But you also need to be prepared and alert for people who will marginalize you and keep you away from advantages and opportunities that are normal for everybody else, simply on the strength of your race. And this is key, Mr. Randolph's father told him that and he referred to people of the Black race as Negroes. He said, a problem of injustice for one Negro is a problem of injustice for every Negro. And he said, you should not let somebody else of our race suffer injustice or suffer persecution simply because they aren't your brother or they're not your neighbor. He said, you need to be prepared to step to the aid of anybody who's being disadvantaged because they are a Negro.
This is a remarkable period of time in Jacksonville history, that first decade of the 20th century, first 2 decades. Not only do you have A. Philip Randolph, Augusta Savage comes out of Jacksonville in that time, a prominent sculptor figure in the Harlem Renaissance. James Weldon Johnson, another Harlem Renaissance figure, the author of Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem. This period, and again, is largely overlooked nationally, statewide, in Jacksonville, but this is really a robust period for African-American life in Jacksonville, correct?
Yeah, it's an accurate assessment. Jacksonville was the most important city in Florida at the time, and it continued really to hold that position well into the 20th century until the Cold War years. And it was only eclipsed in its importance by the economic growth of the cities of South and Central Florida that came with the post-World War II boom, the Cold War era, and the advances of some of those emerging technologies like air conditioning and pest control and interstate highways and jet air travel and that sort of thing. But until those things happened, Jacksonville was the economic and political and cultural center of this state. Mr. Johnson and Mr. Randolph both lived here at the time of the Great Fire, and they were aware of the devastation of that, but they were also aware of the remarkable renaissance that occurred in the decade or so after the Great Fire. But interestingly, if you've read much about James Weldon Johnson, you may recall that he was advised by one of his old friends with whom he had grown up here in Jacksonville. As an adult, he considered returning to Jacksonville later in life, and his friend discouraged him. He said, It's not what it used to be. And what he was talking about was an increase and sharpening of the impulse for white racial supremacy. He was talking about sharper racism in Jacksonville. Mr. Randolph left Jacksonville in 1909 when he was 20. Let's see, I think it was 1911. Sorry, when he was 22 years old, and turned his back on the city. And if he ever returned, I don't know about it. He may have passed through Jacksonville as part in the course of his travels as the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Jacksonville is certainly a major rail nexus and a base of operations for the Brotherhood. But he never reestablished residence here, and he was. I think it's fair to say that he became radicalized by his experience as a young man of color growing up in Jacksonville in the last decade of the 19th century, first decade of the 20th century.
There was an incident I've read about where his parents actually armed themselves to deal with a lynch mob. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, so a African American man had been imprisoned, jailed, and when he was incarcerated, Reverend Randolph, Mr. Randolph's father, learned that a lynch mob was bound and headed for the jail to remove him from legal custody and lynch him. And Mr. Randolph joined a party of others, neighbors, colleagues, other ministers, to go to the jail, block the entrance, and protect the imprisoned man. They succeeded in preventing the lynching, but he armed Mrs. Randolph, Mr. Randolph's mother, with a shotgun, as the story goes, which she placed across her lap and sat on the front porch of the house in the event of any reprisals against Mr. Randolph or his family.
Wow.
It's the kind of thing that's the kind of memory that did not leave young Mr. Randolph, as you can easily imagine.
Yeah, definitely. That might have helped make his decision to leave Jacksonville. Where did he go when he left?
He worked as a cook on a steamship, and he sailed from the port of Jacksonville to New York, and he relocated there and settled there. That became his base of operations for most of the rest of his life. And he found work there and eventually became involved in publishing a newsletter. He became involved with the NAACP, but he was more radical by ideology than those associated with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Indeed, Mr. Randolph became a socialist, and he became a critic of the system of capitalism. It's one of the things that made him a likely candidate to be approached to get involved with organized labor. Mr. Randolph was, in later years, his ideology, I think, made a departure from the tenets of what we would call socialism, although he was later in life accused of being a communist, or certainly a communist sympathizer. Of course, a lot of people were accused of that during the Red Scares and the Cold War and that sort of thing. But what really motivated him and what he saw as being fundamental to justice was economic justice. And he saw that people who controlled wealth in the capitalist economic system were better positioned to exclude access to that wealth and exclude access to upward mobility, social and economic mobility for anyone that wasn't really seen as part of their club. And that was an affront to Mr. Randolph. And he saw socialism as an answer to that, not communism, but a system in which society, through the institutions of government, actually had control of some of the key mechanisms of infrastructure and the systems that people depended on for a living. He was an advocate for such things as public schools. He thought education and literacy were critical to the advancement of all people. But he really saw being able to get and keep a good paying, secure job as being critical to equality in the American system.
So he's in New York, and this is the peak of the Harlem Renaissance. And you're talking about Alain Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey in there, and all these black thinkers and artists and
Zora Neale
jazz
Hurston.
musicians.
Yeah.
Yes, Zora for sure. I mean, this is a pinnacle of American culture. Forget about any sort of racial identity attached to it. It's also, and this ties into some of the labor stuff. Uh, Coming out of the previous golden age or gilded age. I think we're in a second gilded age, but he sees the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and that enormous wealth all around him. So it's a remarkable time for someone like him to be in New York, and I'm fascinated by the labor end of it, and this I think is where he gets a lot of his attention from. You mentioned that, but explain the Pullman, the black Pullman workers, how prominent they were, how big this group was, and why it was so important for him to lead this group towards unionization.
Railroads were extremely important in the American economic system and socially. In the 19 teens, the 1920s, really they didn't really yield their primacy in the American system until after the end of the Second World War. And travel by rail was pretty much how people migrated back and forth or moved or carried on business between in different parts of the country. There was no system of federal highways. There was certainly no interstate highway system, but even such things as highways that crossed between, municipal connected cities, moved between states, that sort of thing, they were still pretty primitive. Air travel was, that was only accessible for people who were, number one, affluent, and number two, risk takers. It was seen as a pretty dangerous way to get around, right? So rail was it. And being able to work as a porter in sleeping cars, which were how, people with means traveled between cities long distances, that was seen as really being a critical, secure way to get a job. But railroad workers had always been exploited by the very powerful capital interests that control railroads. And unionization of the sleeping car porters was one of the mechanisms that was developed to try to overcome that pattern of exploitation. And Mr. Randolph turned out to be a tenacious and persuasive and compelling advocate for the interests of the sleeping car porters. And it was on the strength of his, I would argue it was on the strength of his power of reason and his compelling persona, his dignity, and the credibility that he exuded, that he was able to make deals on behalf of the Brotherhood and advocate for their acceptance by the railroad corporations, who eventually came to see it as in their best interest to have a stable, well-trained workforce of people who were devoted to their work, who really were sort of on the front lines of the customer-facing experience of long-distance overnight travel by train. And on the strength of that, Mr. Randolph really became the head of the first successful Black labor union, and the first one that eventually became associated with the American Federation of Labor. That put Mr. Randolph on the map. It also put him in the unusual position of developing close relationships with progressive-minded Black leaders in communities all over the United States. If there were members of the Brotherhood living in places such as Atlanta or Jacksonville or New Orleans or New York or Chicago or on the West Coast, they and Mr. Randolph knew each other. He also became the person who controlled the capital, the resources of the union. Dues were paid to the union to keep it in business. He deployed those resources strategically to support what he saw as the interests of certainly of his members, but he also deployed them in support of local initiatives that he saw as important. And one example of that was the Montgomery bus boycott. It's most noted as the place where Rosa Parks refused to get up from her seat. Blacks of Montgomery boycotted the bus system. It imposed a great deal of strain it also drew Dr. Martin Luther King to Montgomery, right, to help advocate for the demonstrators in the bus boycott. It was Mr. Randolph's financial intervention through, I believe, and let me check my fact on this when we're done, but I think it was the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who was the person who invited Dr. King to Montgomery. But Mr. Shuttlesworth was also a close friend of Mr. Randolph's, and he was able to persuade Mr. Randolph to help support the Montgomery bus boycott financially and help support bringing Dr. King to Montgomery to help be a voice and an advocate. It's just one more example of how without Mr. Randolph, there would have been unlikely to be some of the seminal moments in the civil rights movement, and maybe no Dr. Martin Luther King, not as we know him in his legacy in the 21st century.
So I have a really dumb question. So how did he become leader of the sleeping car porters union, since he had never been a sleeping car porter himself?
He was seen as a persuasive advocate, and he was hired not because he knew anything about railroads or sleeping car porters. He was hired because he was seen as somebody who he had been editing a newsletter, and he had been editorializing on the subject of Black economic equality. And on the strength of his credibility and his intellectual capacity and his perspective on how people got to social justice through economic justice, it seemed like a natural fit. And of course, it turned out to be.
Yeah.
And through this work, he, whatever, adjective you want to use, forces, enlightens, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who we think of as this great progressive president, did not want to require equal labor and hiring practices, but through Philip A. Randolph's work, FDR changed his mind on that.
Yeah. Unpacking and understanding Franklin Delano Roosevelt in terms of his personal values, his sense of social justice, his ideology, that's a life's work all by itself. He was a fabulously complicated person. He seems to have been an example of a patrician elite who had an instinct for social justice, but he was an extraordinarily shrewd politician as well. And he needed Congress to do the things that he wanted to see happen in order to advance the progressive causes that he was advocating, in order to help rescue the American economy, in order to sustain the initiatives of the Federal New Deal that was the hallmark of his administration during the 1930s, during his first two terms in office. He needed Congress, and Congress at that point was dominated by Democrats, specifically white Southern Democrats. And so there were limits to how far Franklin Roosevelt could go in challenging the boundaries of white racial supremacy anywhere in the United States. And he knew very well what those boundaries and limits were. And so did Mr. Randolph. They both were shrewd and canny observers of politics and voting and the mechanism of getting legislation passed. What Mr. Randolph did was threaten a march on Washington that would help immobilize the Capitol, call into question the capacity of the administration to manage labor relations and manage the access to federal employment. And in threatening that, he actually gave President Roosevelt a card to play that had not been in the president's hand up until then. The president could, in making a explanation to white Southern Democrats in Congress, senators and members of Congress, he could say, look, don't blame me for this. Blame these guys that have got literally a gun to my head and are making me do this. In the back of President Roosevelt's mind, I am pretty sure, and other historians are also inclined to think, that Roosevelt was silently thanking Mr. Randolph for putting a gun to his head, figuratively, and making him do what he knew was the right thing to do all along. But it gave him a good excuse. What it did effectively was give him political cover to do something that he would have wanted to do, but really, I think, felt precluded, prohibited by politics from doing. And that was passing by executive order the Fair Employment Practices Act, which guaranteed employment to African Americans in shipyards and other military and defense facilities that were getting federal appropriations in the 1940s as the United States was building up into the Second World War.
Wow. And let me just mention, you mentioned that you're not sure he ever came back to Jacksonville, but that's something that benefited blacks in Jacksonville, where there were shipyards and and railroads too. So
It did, although it's fair to note that segregation in employment in those shipyards was still the order of the day in shipyards in the American South. So, for example, in my research on shipbuilding at Tampa Shipbuilding during World War II, I came across evidence of an incident in which a shipyard supervisor was under pressure to increase production. There was always a lot of pressure to increase shipyard production and shipbuilding efficiency. And welding became increasingly common in shipbuilding in the 1930s. It was seen as a way to save weight, accelerate productivity. It was faster. It was much more efficient. But when the time came to train welders, there was a great deal of pushback from white welding crew supervisors who said, well, yeah, you can promote an effort. You can promote a black, and he didn't use that term, but he said you can promote a black to supervise a welding crew, but I can guarantee you one thing: by the end of that work week, that black is going to be a dead black. And that was endemic characteristic of the attitude in shipyards and other facilities in the American South. Yes, good paying jobs became available. Set asides, they didn't use that word then, but access to employment was there. But access to the supervisory and the influential roles that really were the key to advancement and greater pay and greater security, those things were not so accessible for blacks. And the federal government figured this out. The federal government would deploy inspectors to federally funded shipyards to check and see, number one, are you keeping up with your productivity goals? Number two, are you complying with the Fair Employment Practices Act? Are you hiring blacks to work in the shipyards? And they tried to quantify that and measure it. But they pretty quickly discovered that if they made too big of a fuss and they raised too many objections about inadequate minority employment in shipyards, the next thing that they knew was that white workers and white foremen and white managers would slow down productivity, and it really became a counterproductive episode. So both sides sort of tiptoed around each other, and they found an accommodation that wouldn't provoke too much backlash. It was a better situation than it had been before. It still was nothing like approaching what you and I would consider true equality in employment.
Resistance to these federal measures for equality are not uncommon. You think of Brown versus the Board of Education, that's 1954. It's a full 2 decades on before some school systems across the South are integrated, but you got to start somewhere, right? And get that ball rolling. So that's what he did with employment, federal employment. You also mentioned integration of the armed forces. What role did he play in getting that achieved?
Harry Truman was a white Southerner, and there is no evidence that he had a great deal more instinct, and in fact, perhaps less of an instinct for racial equality than his predecessor, Franklin Roosevelt, did. Nevertheless, he was motivated to carry on the work of the New Deal. He defended that, and he advocated for increased advances in social justice where he could. But he wasn't ready to go all the way to integrating the armed forces. Blacks had served in combat units during the First and Second World War, but they served mainly in racially segregated combat units. Mr. Randolph, again, in 1948, did what had worked in 1940, which is to threaten another march on Washington, which led Harry Truman to do what President Roosevelt had done before, which is issue an executive order, which was within the scope of his authority as the President of the United States, ordering the integration of units in the American military. Like the Fair Employment Practices Act, it certainly met with a lot of pushback and a lot of strategic and tactical efforts to get around it on the part of white supremacists in the leadership of the military. But nevertheless, it became the law and became the rule, and became really part of what led to gradually increasing integration in the armed forces, to the point where you saw in some cases in combat units in Vietnam in the 1960s, military units, especially in the Army, that were majority African American.
And let me just add that his threats to march on Washington were not idle threats. I mean, they actually started organizing to prepare for such a march.
They did indeed. And the fact that Mr. Randolph had already been putting so much thought and organizing and recruiting into staging a march, number one, it made it a credible threat in the first place. So it wasn't like he was just saying, hey, I've got an idea. This will embarrass everybody. He was actually organizing the mechanics, and he had proven himself in his role as the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters to be somebody who actually knew how to, if you'll pardon the pun, he knew how to make the trains run on time. He could get people together and organize them to accomplish big, ambitious things. So he was credible. By nature, he was a credible person. He, as I said earlier, he exuded credibility just as a person. But those were credible threats. And the fact that he had been that far down the road of organizing those marches in the first place made it all that much easier during the presidency of John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s, when he again raised the specter of a march on Washington to compel the administration to be more active, to act forcefully on social justice and civil rights legislation. The Kennedy administration had proposed a civil rights bill in the summer of 1963. It was dead on arrival in Congress. The Kennedy administration knew it. Everybody in Congress knew it. Mr. Randolph knew it. And nevertheless, they wanted to push the administration and push the White House and push congressional leadership in the House and Senate to actually try to move this. That was the point of the March on Washington. And the fact that he had been developing the strategies and tactics for this before made it that much easier. He had a lot of help. I mean, this wasn't a single-handed operation on his part. The person who gets most of the organizing credit for actually managing the hard, nitty-gritty, boots-on-the-ground logistics of the march was a Black civil rights advocate named Bayard Rustin, Rustin.
And he worked with Philip Randolph, correct?
He did indeed. They worked pretty closely together. Rustin was a character. He was about as different as anybody could possibly get from A. Philip Randolph. He was gay. He was flamboyantly gay. It was said on the part of people who knew him well that he was so far out of the closet as a gay male that he didn't even really know that the closet existed. He had been raised as a Quaker, and he was quite radicalized ideologically. He may very well have been a member of the Communist Party of the United States, and his association with Dr. Randolph really came at a considerable cost to. Excuse me, I said Dr. Randolph, Mr. Randolph. Their association came at an increasing cost to Mr. Randolph, who was challenged by his fellow leaders in the Brotherhood and in the Civil Rights Movement, others allies in the NAACP, others in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, in the whole sort of the constellation of civil rights organizations. Their leadership said, this guy is really causing a lot of trouble. He's threatening embarrassment to us. He's really too far out there. You're going to get us in trouble and cause us negative publicity. And of course, his association with communism made the whole civil rights movement increasingly vulnerable to accusations that it was inspired and manipulated and driven by Soviet communism.
But he stuck with him anyway.
Oh, yeah, he stuck with him anyway. That was one of the things I think that characterized Mr. Randolph. He seems to have been pretty much immune to intimidation. Yeah, I mean, he brushed all of those things off. I think that if militant opponents of the civil rights movement and the movement for Black social justice, if they had targeted A. Philip Randolph for retribution, for physical harm, as they did Dr. Martin Luther King, it's likely that it would have been Mr. Randolph who was assassinated instead of Dr. King in 1968 or whenever it would have happened, in which case we would be observing an annual A. Philip Randolph Day to this day instead of a Martin Luther King holiday. Dr. King himself had the grave misfortune to be martyred. And taking nothing away from him or his work or his memory or his legacy, but nevertheless, as I've said already in this interview, if that hadn't been for Mr. Randolph, there wouldn't have been a Martin Luther King.
Yeah. The story of Bayard Rustin and the behind-the-scenes machinations of the different civil rights organizations leading up to the March on Washington is told in a Netflix film entitled Rustin that was released in 2023. If folks are interested in that, it's a fun watch. A. Philip Randolph, there is a character portraying him, appears in the films. I think a lot of people, let's dig a little more in on the March on Washington and A. Philip Randolph's relationship to it. The name of the march was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The jobs part has largely been glossed over in the past 50 years, but the March on Washington was a labor movement. It was as much about employment as it was about voting or equality of any other stripe.
Getting my memory aid out here.
Oh yeah. See, you've got a poster.
Alan is showing us a UAW says jobs and freedom for every American poster that he had in his office. But that jobs point, that's really been, and where Martin Luther King was assassinated, he was marching with sanitation workers in Memphis.
Striking,
yeah. This was not a voting rights deal. This was about jobs, and obviously, again, Philip Randolph plays directly into this. It's interesting how the jobs angle, the union angle, the labor angle has been erased from those events.
Yeah, that's a good insight, and you're absolutely right to say that aspect of the March on Washington has really been subsumed. Almost everything else about it has been subsumed, at least in historical perspective, by Dr. King's speech. And the soaring rhetoric and the almost, the spiritual undertones, which always were part of what Dr. King employed in his discourse, in his rhetoric, in his public pronouncements, his role as an ordained minister, all of that subsumed what you correctly say was really the foundational impulse behind the March on Washington, which was advocacy for economic justice. And that was entirely consistent with Mr. Randolph's lifelong work, his leadership in organized labor. It was entirely faithful to his advocacy for equal employment and equal access to work in the Defense Department and in the military. And it was organized labor unions, the UAW, as you mentioned, as was identified in this poster. It was those unions that helped turn out people who contributed to the march and actually got on buses, traveled across the country, and showed up. One of the people in the audience was my dissertation advisor from the University of Florida, a labor historian named Bob Ziegler, the late Robert Ziegler, actually was in Washington and a grad student at the time of the march. And it was he who picked up this poster off the ground in the mall. And wow. He, in the foreword to a book that he wrote about the incident years later, he said that he was still, in later life, he was still embarrassed to admit that he didn't stay for Dr. King's speech. He said, I didn't care about any of that.
Oh, no.
He said, he said, for me, this wasn't about, religion or spirituality. He said, I heard of Martin Luther King, but I was there because he said I was training himself. He was learning to become a historian of American labor. That's what motivated him. He said, and that's what this event was about for me. So I showed up for that. But then I had to go pick up my wife after work, and so I left early. But on my way out, he said, I thought I should have a souvenir of this. So he picked up this poster and framed it. It hung in his office at UF until his death, and now it's in my office.
Was Mr. Randolph married? Did he have any children?
He did marry. He did not have children. His wife was a few years older than him, and she predeceased him. When he died in New York City, he died alone in an apartment on May 16th, 1979, at 90 years of age.
Wow.
Yeah, that's amazing. So we think about, 1963, he was born in 1889. So he was in his 70s which in the 60s, I mean, someone in their 70s today, we see, 70-year-old, NFL football coaches, and we just have a different perception of what it means to be 70. But in 1963, 70 was old. Okay, and he was in his 70s. He dies in 1989 at 90 years old. How did he spend, the 70s, the 80s, the final decades of his life?
Died in 1979, not 89.
Oh, so I apologize.
Right. Yeah, that's okay. And he became the president of a nonprofit institute called the A. Philip Randolph Institute, and it was an advocacy nonprofit. It allowed him to travel, make speeches, accept awards, which he did a lot of later in life. He did some writing, wrote some recollections, agreed to a number of interviews associated with some of the closest people who had been closest associates, including Mr. Rustin, who stayed in close contact with Mr. Randolph up until his death. It was Mr. Rustin who actually made the public announcement of Mr. Randolph's death on behalf of the A. Philip Randolph Institute.
Wow.
So he lived what I would call not an impoverished, a rather, relatively genteel retirement, and one that we would consider dignified. But this was a guy who he never was motivated by the trappings of wealth or notoriety or glamour, and his later years were characterized by the same sort of dignity and probity that had really been characteristic of him all his life.
Came a long way from growing up in Jacksonville as a preacher's kid.
He did. So here in Jacksonville today, we have A. Philip Randolph Boulevard, which is 2 blocks away from here. It runs in between the Veterans Memorial Arena and the baseball grounds. It used to be called Florida Avenue, and it now runs north into the historic East Side area to the neighborhood where Mr. Randolph grew up. There is a park in that neighborhood called A. Philip Randolph Park. There is a school named for Mr. Randolph, and in the Prime Osborne Convention Center, there is a meeting room called the A. Philip Randolph Meeting Room. And the continuity there comes from the fact that convention center was built in 1919 as the Jacksonville train station. So it was the train station from which people boarded and departed and to which they arrived when they were traveling by train during the heyday of that medium for travel. And the meeting room that is now named for Mr. Randolph was the racially segregated so-called colored waiting room in the Jacksonville train station.
Wow.
And there are still some examples of segregated water fountains and racially segregated dual-facing ticket counters. One on the colored waiting room side where blacks could buy tickets and do business with the passenger agents, and the other one on the grander, more imposing main lobby of the terminal where whites did their business.
Wow. And there's a statue in Washington, isn't there, in Union Station?
I think that's right. I'm not remembering that for sure, but if there isn't, there sure ought to be.
Yeah.
Alan Bliss, CEO, Jacksonville Historical Society. Find them online, Jax with an X, jaxhistory.org. This has really been wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing.
It's been fascinating. Thanks.
Thanks to you, gentlemen. Have a great day. I welcome the opportunity to discuss that great American anytime.
It reminds me a little, Craig, of our recent interview on Janet Reno. Yes, a figure born in Florida, from Florida, but my goodness, what A. Philip Randolph, like Janet Reno, meant on the national and global scale really eclipses them as just a Florida personality.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and what's interesting too is, and you guys discussed it some, is how important the labor movement was to civil rights and to finding basically fairness for people who were born in very poor circumstances, to give them an equal chance with everybody else. And these days unions are definitely under attack by folks who are motivated to stop a lot of the initiatives that A. Philip Randolph advocated for.
Right, and that is all based in wanting to promote inequality, labor inequality, the inequality of wealth, the inequality of access to capital. Again, labor movements, civil rights movements, human rights movements, equal rights movements. It is equality. And when you read the headlines today, there are people still fighting for equality, and there are a lot of people not. a lot of people fighting for inequality. And I don't think there's any question when you look at the news, we are in a second Gilded Age where CEOs and top executives' pay is out of all proportion to what the rank and file make. And there was a period, and Reagan was the primary union buster of them all, and certainly unions were on the wane. But I think unions are, I know this, unions and public sentiment about the need for unions is on the upswing as we see CEOs making $50-100 million a year, as there are more and more billionaires and more homeless people. Folks are able to look at this. A lot of that stigma from the Cold War has come off of socialism and say, you know what? There ought to be a more equal distribution of the wealth that's being produced around this country. And a lot of this ties directly back to our subject from today.
Well, and the other thing too is, I think it speaks volumes that the Florida legislature made it a lot harder for unions for teachers and for municipal workers and so forth, but not for unions for firefighters and police officers. So there is a recognition of the power of unions right there, that they want to cripple the ones that they don't like, but meanwhile favor the ones they do like. Welcome to Florida.